Hello everyone, this is the Safety Net and Poverty panel. My name is Tom Sanford, and I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator of this panel, Professor John Harrison, who has been on the faculty here since 1993.
I'm John Harrison. If you're looking for college game day, it's over that way. But if you're looking for a panel on one of the most important policy questions confronting the country having to do with programs that spend a large fraction of national income and affect the lives of tens of millions of Americans, you've come to the right place. From time to time, the Federalist Society asks me for advice on who should serve on its panels, and I always say pretty much the same thing, which is find people who know things. This time, they found people who know a lot. We have some serious substantive experts. This is going to be an excellent panel, and I will say just a couple of words about each of them. First will be Professor Julia Mahoney of the law school here, an expert in federal fiscal law with JD from the Yale Law School. Next, Christopher DeMuth of the Hudson Institute, an individual with a long history of public service and academic work, a JD from the University of Chicago. After that, William Galston, also with a long history of public service and academic work, currently at the Brookings Institution, with a PhD from the University of Chicago. Finally, Professor David Super of Georgetown, the Legal Academy's foremost expert in programs of public assistance. Professor Mahoney?
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I forgot something, a last minute commentary. I'm terribly sorry, Julia. Mr. DeMuth suggested that I mention that he is the co-chair of the Federalist Society's Visiting Committee, perhaps his most important distinction. Sorry for the interruption, Julia.
Excellent. Good afternoon. I am Julia Mahoney. I teach here at the University of Virginia School of Law, and I am delighted that my institution has had the chance to host this symposium, and I am thrilled that so many of you have been willing to travel to Charlottesville to tackle hard issues relating to poverty, inequality, and of course, safety nets. What I plan to do in my role as the first speaker on this panel is to use the 12 or so minutes allotted to me to discuss American exceptionalism and the past, present, and I hope future of the safety net in the United States. In particular, I'm going to push back hard against two notions, the ones that have achieved conventional wisdom status in many quarters. First, that the United States is a safety net laggard when compared to other rich, highly developed nations. And second, that the obvious thing that we should be thinking about doing if we wish to improve our safety net is to become more like these other rich nations, particularly Canada and rich nations in Western and Northern Europe. What I will argue instead is that we have a unique history and unique institutions that have provided us with a unique sort of safety net that is in no way inferior, in fact, which I would argue suits our needs, or has at least at some points in our history, and to some degree now suited our needs. It's bouncy at its best, and thus a key component of what, at least until fairly recently, as we've been discussing this weekend, and we'll of course discuss more on this panel, at least until fairly recently, has been an extraordinarily entrepreneurial and dynamic society. I do have to admit, of course, that right now our safety net is not as bouncy as it once was, and not as bouncy as, in my judgment, it has the potential to be. So I'm going to detail some of the reasons why what should be a bouncy safety net, catching those in distress, but then propelling them back up to give them the second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. chances that I think have been the hallmark of a lot of what the United States has achieved in its fairly short history, these days is looking too much like a sticky hammock. People end up in the safety net and they are kind of glued to it, or even worse, it's not even a hammock where they stay pretty stationary, albeit a bit stuck. Some aspects of our society, what should be a safety net, instead looks more and more like a black hole. That is, that it's hard to escape that force once people get near it. And after describing some of these problems, I will offer some solutions, or at least I'm going to offer some thoughts for some ideas that I believe will have the potential to serve as foundations for solutions. So first, why do I see America as not a safety net laggard? Because many policy experts, in my view, and academics have a way too cramped definition of safety net. When we look carefully and when we take into account institutions such as government-provided or government-subsidized health care and health insurance, when we look at Social Security and retirement savings, when we look hard at public expenditures on education, the United States does not look like a safety net laggard compared to other rich nations. It is true that many of these institutions that I have just mentioned, and that I believe are very important to our social stability and our social dynamism, differ greatly from the means-tested government programs that extend only to the poor and near poor, such as the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, that my co-panelist, David Super, is going to be discussing, have a lot more to say about in a few minutes. I recognize that SNAP and other such programs aimed at the poor or the near poor are often the first thing that leaps to people's minds when they hear that phrase, safety net. But I think that when we ponder what prevents and ameliorates poverty, we have to look at things with a far wider lens. We have to look far beyond the obvious. And the fact is that as U.S. society has evolved, programs with benefits that flow substantially, even primarily, to those other than the poor and non-poor are absolutely crucial in terms of providing some kind of protection that will prevent or help allay the bad effects of poverty. Perhaps most striking, when comparing the United States to other rich nations, many forget about our so-called third sector of nonprofit firms or civic society. One of the courses I teach here at the University of Virginia School of Law is nonprofit organizations. And every time I teach it, I am struck anew by the extraordinarily rich tradition of generosity that the United States has. This tradition of generosity predates our founding as a nation, our independence as a nation. It was present in colonial times. It fueled the establishment of many charitable institutions that have become some of the world's greatest hospitals, where people from all over the world who could go anywhere for health care choose to come here. Even today, in fact, especially today, Americans of all political leanings give time, money, and expertise to a wide range of causes in a way and to a degree that residents and citizens of other rich nations simply do not. These institutions of civic society both substitute for government, often providing services similar to those that our governmental institutions do, but they go beyond that. They provide important goods and services, including religious instruction and support, that government cannot. Even where the United States provides safety net services that have direct analogs in other developed nations, we are exceptional. Looking at Medicare and Medicaid, we see that there is far more respect for and various provisions made for individuality than is the case in a lot of other societies. In fact, in most other societies. It is interesting to me that the Independent Payment Advisory Board contained in the Affordable Care Act has incited so much opposition because it was modeled on institutions in other nations that did get pretty broad acceptance. But that kind of rationing, where a panel of experts deliberately insulated from the political process make life and death rationing decisions, that was not a good fit. It didn't map on well to American institutions and political commitments. So what has gone wrong? Why do I say that our safety net is not fulfilling, at least in my judgment, its potential? Why are we not hearing so much that in American society what we have is a safety net that provides a hand up, not a handout? It used to be that Americans were quite confident about that it was a very important part of our identity. We've already touched this weekend on a number of the prime suspects for what has gone wrong, but let me go over a few of them very quickly and then add some more. First, as we mentioned at last evening's panel on capitalism, the presence of cliffs, whereby benefits plunge or even disappear altogether if beneficiaries earn more money. These cliffs are many. They include health insurance premiums under the Affordable Care Act, rights to live in many public housing projects, lots of student loan forgiveness programs. It is a long, long list, and disturbingly, it is growing. Second, occupational licensing requirements. In the last generation or two, the percentage of jobs that require some form of occupational license has soared. That makes it, of course, much tougher to redeploy human capital to get geared up for some kind of new position. Next, tightened credit under Dodd-Frank and other various reform measures, justified by the need to protect people from making choices, because sometimes the financial choices they make don't turn out well, particularly if they're making the sorts of choices that fuel a dynamic entrepreneurial society. These all combine to lead to fewer formed businesses and fewer chances to prosper. There's also regulatory uncertainty. One striking thing about both Dodd-Frank and the Affordable Care Act is these were very, very, very complex statutes that could not be enforced as written. There were simply too many internal tensions, and they weren't all that specific. So much was left to regulatory bodies, often regulatory bodies that weren't even established yet. That, I think, and many are concerned, that has helped add to a climate where forming a new business, going off in a new direction, seems to be, it's much harder to figure out what the rewards are. And that is not all. We have also made mistakes extremely costly for many citizens. Civil forfeiture is rampant, so if you have saved any money, it's pretty easy to lose it if you get mixed up with the wrong people, even tangentially. Excessive fines imposed by police departments, such as the ones in Ferguson, Missouri, overcriminalization that can lead to criminal records that make it hard to get jobs or even incarceration. And of course, as I think Chris will talk about more, a lot of interest groups now, people who have a lot of good middle-class jobs, are the result of what one might call the poverty industrial complex. So what should we do? My argument is that in thinking about where to go next, we should look at what we have. Don't try to copy some kind of fantasy paradise across the Atlantic. They are in even less good financial condition than we are. Even if they have built utopia, which I very much doubt that they have, it really doesn't look like it's going to last for much more than another half generation or so. So I think we should focus on what we do well. And what can we do? Number one, I think we can harness the potential of our civic societal institutions better, particularly in the area of health care. The Affordable Care Act focused on insuring people, on covering them, but coverage is not access. We blundered into a system whereby our leading hospitals only have to offer, quote, community benefit, not demonstrable charitable payoffs, in order to have nonprofit status. We should look at that. And there are many other things coming up from the grassroots, free clinics, for example, or low-cost clinics. Again, they harness what America has done well. Second, we should think very seriously about a major restructuring of U.S. government finances in order, 30 seconds more, John, in order to give us some breathing room. I have argued, I'm writing a paper with Ed Kitch, who is here, my co-author, who's here in the audience today, that we should consider restructuring United States government debt and even possibly selling off some of our nation's assets. So with that, I turn it over to Chris.
America, as in all of the other advanced democracies, we have long had a substantial consensus in favor of a substantial welfare state, consisting of, first, a safety net or social insurance programs to cushion the vicissitudes of birth and life and older age, and second, anti-poverty programs to alleviate and support those of very low incomes who are facing serious material deprivation. Within that consensus, there are many serious debates concerning the welfare state's spending levels, financial structure, eligibility requirements, and most of all, effectiveness, their effects on incentives to work and save, on marriage and family structure. These issues are being discussed by others on this panel, elsewhere in the symposium. I want to focus on an overarching issue in the form of two propositions about our welfare state that I suspect will be new and surprising to many people here, as indeed they are surprising to many people that work professionally in the field. The first is that most welfare state spending does not go to people who are poor. Most of it goes to people who are reasonably well off or very well off. The safety net is for everyone, most of us non-poor. Social Security, $890 billion of spending this year. Medicare, $550 billion of spending this year, keeps some older people from falling into poverty, but the lion's share in payments and medical care goes to people who are solidly middle class. This is true even for unemployment insurance. During the recent hard recession, only 25% of those receiving UI were people who, having lost their jobs, would have been in poverty but for the receipt of the UI payments. Our poverty programs are mostly in-kind support, health care, food, housing, an array of social services. The expenditures go overwhelmingly to those who provide goods and services to the poor, who are thoroughly middle class or more: doctors, farmers, grocers, housing developers, landlords, social workers, employees of hospitals, employees and owners of food and pharmaceutical companies. Of the approximately $800 billion of federal and state annual spending on means-tested poverty programs, only a small portion, 18%, $140 billion, consists of actual cash transfers to the poor. That is temporary assistance for needy families, the Supplemental Security Income program for the blind and disabled and aged, and the Earned Income Tax Credit program. This pattern of spending is essential for organized political support for the welfare state. We could abolish material poverty overnight by cashing out the welfare state and making it into a minimum income program for everybody, as proposed over the years by many academics, thinkers from both left and right. There is no partisan or interest group support for such proposals. If they ever gained traction in practical politics, the groups that provide in-kind services to the poor would crush them in the same manner that they crush the teachers' unions, for example, crush school voucher proposals. Of course, the cash payments under such a program would still find their way in some significant degree to doctors, nurses, farmers, grocers, landlords, and so forth. But the shift from political allocation to market allocation would be fatal to political organizing on behalf of the targeted in-kind programs, which is essential to maintaining spending at current levels. Second proposition is that our welfare state is substantially a debt-financed welfare state. The emergence and growth of our modern welfare state since the late 1960s has been simultaneous with the emergence and growth of routine, continuous, year-to-year deficit spending. Before 1970, government borrowing was for wars, for response to natural or economic disasters, for large public investments, ventures of one fourth or kind of another, beginning with Alexander Hamilton's assumption of the Revolutionary War debts of the states in order to solidify the credibility of the federal government. A few years later, Thomas Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana territories from Napoleon, which was a debt-financed purchase and one with a very high return. It was always understood that debts of this sort would be repaid as promptly as possible in good times or over the life of the investments. Andy Jackson, the founder of the Democratic Party, ran for president on paying off all of the remaining war debts from the Revolution and the War of 1812, a promise that he fulfilled. Many modern investments in infrastructure, roads, and highways are very, very good debt at the local level. Keynes himself was a budget balancer over the life of the business cycle, but in the 46 years since 1980, in only 4 years have we not run a budget deficit, and the deficits have been large and growing over time. They have left us with a debt that is today $19 trillion, more than 100% of annual GDP. If we combine that with a lot of unmeasured implicit debt, the debt is vastly higher than anything in our history, even the previous high following World War II, which itself came hard on the heels of the Great Depression. It is growing rapidly, more than $600 billion this year, more than $800 billion if we don't do anything in 2020. It'll be by 2025 barreling through $1.2 to $1.34 trillion every year. The welfare state payments over this period have become immune largely to annual appropriating and the give and take of budget allocation. Almost all of them are entitlements or mandatory spending, not subject to appropriation. And our deficit cutting exercises in recent years, such as the 2013 sequester exercise, have excluded almost all of these kinds of payments. The budget cutting has been limited to cutting national defense and addressing general government, for example, holding the line on uncompetitive salaries for federal judges, things such as that. This is fundamentally new and different. It is a more profound change than simply the size of the debt. Traditionally, borrowing for the purposes I have mentioned, whether it was successful or not, was at least intended to protect and expand the future. Today's borrowing is not episodic, it is not for the future, it is continuous, and it is being spent in substantial share on current private consumption. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm a big consumer myself, but it is not spending that has much of any hope of enlarging the future and thereby repaying itself. Instead, it is borrowing from the future. Through a long series of incremental steps and adjustments, both our political leaders and the electorate have grown used to a system in which the government provides substantially greater current spending than it charges us in taxes for that spending, billing the difference to non-voting future generations. In other words, borrowing in the past was the result to external opportunities, developments, and threats. Our huge debt today, unprecedented in size, is something that is endogenous to democracy. We have generated it ourselves through the dynamics of modern democracy. Do I have time to make a final point? Good. 2 minutes. I'll make 2 points then. It is conventionally said that our debt today is unsustainable. I do not like that formulation because it suggests that it is tolerable for the time being, but is something that somebody is going to have to get around to addressing sometime in the future. But as I've tried to emphasize, the bad effects of this debt are in the here and now. The size of our debt is so large that it is, in my judgment, that of many others, seriously imposing on economic performance and growth today. It is corrupting our politics. It is developing false expectations in millions of people, many of modest means. Most of all, it is a safety net failure. The purpose of maintaining a low debt is not accounting rectitude. It is to make sure that the government is prepared to respond quickly, forcefully, energetically in the face of crises that individual citizens cannot hope to cope with on their own. Whatever success our social insurance programs have had in spreading around risk in the population, compensating for short-sightedness on the part of individuals, the debt-financed welfare state has certainly concentrated a huge amount of risk in the government itself, and thereby will impede its ability to provide the most important form of social insurance at all. A major crisis that hit us today would be very, very difficult. It would be worse than responding to World War II at the end of the Great Depression. Nevertheless, it is unsustainable. That is to say, largely for well-known demographic reasons, the debt-financed welfare state is, one way or the other, going to be replaced by a tax-financed welfare state pretty soon. On its current trajectory of borrowing and spending, it's going to be 10 to 20 years from now. The students in this room will have just made a partner when the problems reach crisis proportions, which would require things such as impossibly high self-defeating tax rates, expenditure cuts that would abruptly defeat the expectations of millions of people, partial default in the form of high inflation, and other extremely unappetizing steps. There are many moderate solutions that are on the table. And many people in think tanks, task forces in Congress have been working on them for a long time. And Dr. Galston is going to discuss some of those, I believe, in a minute. More power to him and to them. But the time is approaching so quickly, and it has been so long when we have seen it coming without doing much of anything, that I believe that it is time also to think about crisis planning. Professor Mahoney's ideas that she adumbrated a bit at the end of her talk, asset sales. Detroit did pretty well in monetizing its art collection to maintain, to some extent, the pensions of retirees, debt restructuring, and enlargement and encouragement of our private sector, which is already the fastest growing part of the economy, are the kinds of things I think we should be looking at. One way or the other, the transition from a debt-financed to a currently tax-financed welfare state is going to be much more contentious and hazardous in the United States than in smaller and more homogeneous nations such as Canada and the Scandinavians. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Galston.
Thanks. Whoa. Well, as I've aged, I've developed an interesting and somewhat unexpected new sideline, and that is as one of the conservatives' favorite sparring partners, which means I play a lot of away games, and here I am again. And this is really steady work too, because the level of partisan polarization in the United States has reached a peak last seen in the late 19th century, when the rising forces of industrial capitalism were doing battle with rural agricultural populists. In these circumstances, I look for islands of agreement in a sea of conflict wherever I can find them. And I am here to bring an olive branch, not to wield a sword. And so I'd like to talk for a few minutes about an important new document entitled Opportunity, Responsibility, and Security, a Consensus Plan for Reducing Poverty and Restoring the American Dream. This represents a collaboration of 16 leading scholars, left and right, on poverty and the safety net and the welfare state. It represents a collaboration between the American Enterprise Institute, of which Chris DeMuth was president for probably more than 2 decades, and the Brookings Institution, which is where I hang my hat, and as in the old Soviet economy, I pretend to work and they pretend to pay me. Now, what is this consensus? Let me describe it for you. First of all, the areas that we should be looking at, a triad of family, work, and education. Second, agreement on core principles, 3 core principles to guide our optic, and they are opportunity, responsibility, and security. The report parses opportunity in the familiar terms of the American dream, and let me read a bit from the writer James Truslow Adams, who invented the term. The dream, he said, is of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability and achievement. It is a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. That is one of the best definitions of equal opportunity in the American dream ever, and it is deservedly influential. I could talk for a long time about individual responsibility, which has guided much of my work in the area of social policy, including welfare reform and teen pregnancy prevention. But let me just talk for a minute about the principle of security, and I'd like to read a quotation to you. It goes as follows. There is no reason why, in a society which has reached the general level of wealth ours has, there should not be guaranteed to all some minimum of food, shelter, and clothing sufficient to preserve health, nor is there any reason why the state should not help to organize a comprehensive system of social insurance in providing for those common hazards of life against which few can make adequate provision. Extra credit for anybody in the room who recognizes that quotation. Anybody? It's from Friedrich Hayek in his famous book, The Road to Serfdom. So I submit that there is at least a basis in principle for substantial agreement on much of what we're talking about. There was also agreement in this bipartisan group about fundamental trends and causes that have evoked many of the worries that have created the basis for this panel. Poor children, the report says, are better off in several ways than they were a few decades ago, but the circumstances and outcomes of upper-income children have improved even more rapidly, leading to ever-widening inequality in the human and financial resources that boost child development. And the report goes on to summarize a liberal conservative consensus about some of the underlying causes for this. They include the loss of manufacturing jobs, stagnating wages for workers without college degrees, labor-saving technological changes, changing relationships between workers and management, the increasing importance of education and training in a post-industrial economy, a less energetic civil society, high rates of incarceration, weaker attachment to the labor force among less educated men, and the rising prevalence of single-parent families among the less educated. I think a very perspicuous and terse summary of a lot of work. Another thing that this report does is to honor the late lamented Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous dictum that every man is entitled to his own opinions but not to his own facts. And so the report summarizes a consensus on a wide body of social science findings. How much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
Good. And here, and here are some of the consensus findings from these liberal and conservative social scientists. One, federal programs have indeed helped to reduce poverty. Two, although we used to tell ourselves a story that we have, yes, higher inequality than in a lot of other advanced industrialized nations, but higher social mobility as well, that story is false. There is no evidence that social mobility in the United States is at a higher rate than in the OECD or other advanced industrialized nations of Western Europe. Conclusion number 3, for the lower half of American male workers, there have been no wage gains corrected for inflation since 1979. And fourth, that gaps in educational attainment and achievement between upper income and lower income children have risen since 1979. Now, against this backdrop of consensus, what policies do liberal and conservatives jointly favor based on the best evidence? And here are some of the things that they agree on. Number one, that we should mount a comprehensive public campaign to promote marriage through shifts in cultural norms. Number two, that we should reduce births outside a framework of family integrity and stability. About 20 years ago, I helped found an organization called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. I'm not asserting a causal relationship, but teen pregnancy in the United States, the rate has declined by 60% since the early 1990s. Change is possible, and change in social norms helps to undergird these possibilities. Number three, a lot of lower educated and young parents are not very good at the job of parenting. And there are evidence-based programs of home visits. There's something called the Nurse-Family Partnership that genuinely helps young and less educated and poor parents to be better parents. And these programs have been demonstrated to have, unlike a lot of other programs, long-lasting effects, not just like a single shot that tends to fade out a few years after it's been administered. 4, we should increase the provision of the tax code known as the Earned Income Tax Credit and extend it to childless adults. This is a proposal that is strongly backed by the unlikely duo of Barack Obama and Paul Ryan, which suggests that it may have a future. Fifth, that we should abandon the paradigm that the only way to avoid poverty is to go to a 4-year college and get a BA. We should focus much more on career and technical education, starting in high schools. I understand why the old vocational education programs that culminated mainly in unusable birdhouses should have been abandoned 30 years ago, but there is a 21st century form of career education that is very necessary. Sixth, that in tandem with a dramatic expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, we should increase the minimum wage in a prudent fashion. Seventh, and finally, we should facilitate the reentry of ex-offenders into the labor market by tearing down many of the legal and regulatory barriers as well as employment practices that have contributed to their almost complete exclusion from the labor market, which gives them an unpleasant choice between starving to death and returning to a life of crime. Not a prudent long-run social policy, in my opinion. The report concludes with a very pertinent question. How are we going to pay for this? Here's the report's answer, which is my answer, which dovetails in interesting ways with what Chris DeMuth has just said. People like me should not be receiving subsidies from people like you. Okay? I am now part of the Medicare program. It should be guaranteed to me, but I should pay full freight for it. There's no reason why the insurance policy that I have in effect under Medicare should be subsidized by anyone else. I should pay full freight, and people like me should pay full freight. And more broadly, that programs that, as Chris said, deliver a disproportionate share of benefits to upper income, middle and upper income people should be re-examined with an eye to redistributing the benefits of those burdens lower down the income scale. It is conventionally said, and this will be my closing thought, it is conventionally said that that will weaken indeed destroy the political coalition in favor of these particular programs. I have empirically studied that question, and that oft-stated fear is false. We can do it politically, and morally speaking, and fiscally speaking, we have no choice but to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. David Super.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for putting on this terrific forum, from which I've learned a lot during this panel and previously. I was asked to talk about anti-poverty programs. We have a large and diverse array of them, most of them by number quite tiny, but several large ones. And it's very difficult to generalize about them descriptively, normatively, or politically. They have come through a variety of mechanisms and a variety of times, are doing a variety of things with a variety of outcomes and effectivenesses. It is very easy to criticize these programs by imagining some sort of a perfect world where we leave out political, operational, budgetary realities. That's really shooting fish in a barrel, and I don't think that would be a worthy use of your time. So what I propose to do instead is to talk about one particular program that I believe exhibits, that is an important program and that for the most part illustrates normative strengths. And in doing that, I am perhaps also implicitly criticizing programs that part company from this one in the respects that I will highlight, and suggesting that this might be a model for moving forward. The program I wish to address is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. My hope is that I can offer some positive suggestions for how we can move forward, and that I will be a little more moored to reality than some proposals for low-income programs, because I will be discussing an actual program that really exists and where the political process has done what I'm suggesting and has done it for a sustained period of time. SNAP has probably had more bipartisan support over the years than most other anti-poverty programs. Maybe not than the Earned Income Tax Credit. You could argue one or two others. But it is by far more popular on a bipartisan basis than most of them. And I think that's for good reason. And let me just identify 6 things that I think account for the justified bipartisan popularity of SNAP, and 6 things in turn that might be useful in guidelines for assessing other responses to poverty and inequality. First, the program has the right balance of financial eligibility. On the one hand, it is not only for the destitute. If you provide programs only for the absolute destitute, you can create work disincentives and fairness questions relative to low-wage workers. On the other hand, it is not a program that expands benefits far above the poverty line to provide general redistribution, which is a mission that I think is fundamentally different than the consensus mission of relieving hardship, which justifies at least to many people, our anti-poverty programs. Second, the program historically, and I'm going to qualify this in a minute, but historically has had the right approach to categorical eligibility. It is not historically based eligibility on age, health, or family composition. It does not, for example, penalize those who do the right thing and postpone childbearing until they have better financial means, the way some other programs do. Recent attacks on childless adults eligibility, which I'll talk more about in a minute, is a departure from that principle, but the general notion of recognizing that food is something that everyone needs and that we should make assistance available to everyone, granted with different reciprocal expectations depending on people's capacity to respond, I think is a very sound one. Third, the program has the right balance in its method of benefit delivery. It privatizes the production of food, the distribution of food, and most importantly, the pricing of food. In that way, it minimizes disruption of the economy, it minimizes inefficiency, it keeps the hand of the state relatively small. On the other hand, it does restrict benefits to a true essential food out of respect for taxpayers and also for political realities. The abolition or near abolition of cash assistance for families over the last 2 decades indicates that the country is deeply suspicious of writing cash checks to people when we're not sure where they go for, and going to a pure cash model, I think, would rekindle those fears. On the other hand, the notion of not getting the government involved in producing these goods, I think, is a good choice. Leaving those functions in the hands of Kroger's and Safeway and what have you is surely a far better choice than asking the feds to take it. Fourth, the approach is towards benefit levels, I think, is fundamentally correct. On the one hand, the benefit levels are Spartan. There are no windfalls there. The research is pretty overwhelming that people that try to buy a month's supply of food on the food stamp benefit plus the amount of cash that food stamp beneficiaries are assumed to be able to spend on food are likely not to even get the basic RDAs of nutrition. On the other hand, while it doesn't have windfalls, it also has been adjusted for inflation, so you don't have it turning into an entirely different program over the years due to the erosion of inflation, which has happened to a number of other programs. Part of why some of them are so mismatched is because they're just different programs because of the effects of inflation over the years. Fifth, the program strikes the correct balance between the acute poor and the chronic poor. It rises, participation in SNAP rises sharply before, during, and after recessions. Now, however, it is falling fairly rapidly as the recovery reaches down to improve the markets for the low-skilled workers who are predominantly SNAP recipients. So we do see responsiveness, more responsiveness than probably any other program except unemployment compensation to the economy. We see responsiveness to natural disasters and other short-term shocks that create acute poor people, and the vast majority of its long-term recipients are children, elderly people, and people with disabilities. That is tied into my last point about benefit levels. You cannot live on food stamps, and the median spell of receipt of food stamps, even in a bad economy, was 12 months, and a great many of those that were for longer than 12 months on the upside of that were the elderly, people with disabilities, or others whose long-term receipt was fairly clear. And finally, and also related to that, the point about acute and chronic poor, is the program has the right response to incentives. It reduces benefits only 24 to 36 cents for every dollar somebody earns, so we don't have cliffs. Tiny cliff that probably should be done away with. But for the most part, we have a relatively modest implicit tax rate, which means that if you're getting food stamps and your boss offers you an extra shift or offers to make you assistant manager, you should say yes. Your family will be better off, and eventually you can glide yourself off of the program, as indeed the vast majority of people who are able to work do. The program has effectively no marriage penalty. It has never discriminated between single and married people, and its grant group composition rules, which are more complicated than I'd like to discuss here, effectively mean that you don't get any advantage by staying unmarried. This is a sharp departure from what a number of other programs have done. More generally, its eligibility and benefit structure has been very well scrubbed over the years by a combination of liberals and conservatives, and the language of incentives has generally been quite persuasive and decisive in turning these debates. So although there have been some glitches in the program, there are a few still left. They don't last very long. They get removed typically by consensus. How do I explain why SNAP has these many strengths that a lot of other programs don't? Several things. One is the program is run by two of the most persistently conservative committees in Congress, the agriculture committees. You don't see a lot of screaming left-wing liberals on the agriculture committees. And so a lot of ideas that sort of flash and crash in other places never go anywhere in the Ag Committee. The Ag Committees are also historically, for good reasons and maybe not so good reasons, among the most bipartisan committees in Congress, and you have respectful discourse on these issues and people who are defending changes or current provisions of the program that don't make much sense generally have given way. It's a low-profile program. It has not interested a lot of people on the extremes. Bernie Sanders' food stamp program agenda is non-existent, or pretty much so. And I think that not being interested into the extremes has been useful. It's a tiny fraction of business for supermarkets and agribusiness, so they actually, contrary to common belief, are not major players in lobbying for it. No, they don't like cash out, but otherwise they really couldn't be bothered. Indeed, there was a lovely sequence in the early 2000s when one prominent conservative Republican after another who favored free trade proposed cuts to protectionist ag subsidies and transferring the money into improving SNAP benefits, much to the embarrassment of liberal Democratic senators from farm states, and it all worked out rather nicely. One caution is that in recent years we have made, I think, a mistake about this with respect to putting a lot of childless workers off the program because they're unable to find jobs within 3 months. I don't think there's anybody who matters involved with SNAP who doesn't think that people that are able to work should work and has a problem with cutting people off if they refuse to work. What we're now doing, though, is cutting people off who can't find work rather than requiring states to run workfare programs which would give people the choice, work or lose benefits. I think that is an unfortunate departure with respect to incentives, with respect to politics, with respect to the candor of the program, and I hope we grow out of that as we've grown out of a lot of other mistakes in the history of the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the rigorous adherence to the time limits by the panelists, we have a few minutes in which I'll invite them, if anybody has any thoughts about what anyone else on the panel said, and in the meantime, you can make your way to the microphone to ask questions from the floor. But first, Professor Mahoney? We're getting the microphones live, but we're working on that.
bipartisan consensus that whatever social welfare state was constructed needed to be sustainable. Why did that vanish, starting about, I'd say, in the mid-1990s, and certainly by about 2000? Because it was a strong...
What was the consensus for?
Well, looking at the first Social Security Act, at the major revisions, including the one in the early 1980s, and then looking at Medicare and Medicaid, at least at least initially, those were fiscally sustainable programs. And there was a strong bipartisan consensus in Congress and amongst the electorate that we weren't going to engage in exactly the kind of spending that you were describing. That we weren't going to make promises to people on which they would rely, huge chunks of the population, and then potentially have to pull the rug out from under them, which is, as Chris, you detailed, exactly where we are. And I'm interested in if there's any explanation as to why that changed.
Well, let me try to square that question with the history as I understand it. As you know, there were decisions made in the 1960s and 1970s about Social Security that threw the program out of balance, creating a trust fund crisis in the early 1980s that was resolved by the Greenspan Commission in 1983 because Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill saw eye to eye on the basic parameters of a solution. It was obvious that the steps taken in 1983 would restore solvency to the program, but not indefinitely. And so right now, the program is not in actuarial balance over 75 years, as is required by the actuaries. And we can state quite precisely when the trust fund will run out of money in the early 2030s, and either the plug will be pulled, or as happened in 1983, adjustments will be made going forward that will recreate balance. And I don't think there's been any change in the underlying sentiment about what we should do, and we surely can't have more of a cliffhanger in the early 2030s than we had in 1983, where we were just a couple of months away from not being able to write Social Security checks. So I'm not sure that anything has changed.
We should talk more later. I would say our position now is a little more extreme than in the early 1980s. But certainly there's much more of a support for a debt for debt finance than I think there has been. But anyway.
Well, there is no. Well, this would be a long discussion, but I think it has more to do. It has more to do with the appetite for debt generally than it has to do with the Social Security program. So the right question is, why are we really willing to tolerate debt more than we used to? And I think there's a very simple answer to that question, and that is the debt is the vector sum of the principal preferences of the two political parties.
But why?
Why? Well,
yes. That's my question.
Okay.
Why?
Why? Because it turns out, and I don't mean this to sound partisan, that the Republican Party since 1978 has been far more interested in cutting taxes than it has in cutting spending.
Any other thoughts from anyone on the panel about, please, Mr. DeMuth?
I don't think I don't think the events of the like Bill, the events of the 80s and 90s represented much of a change. In the 1970s, we were making statutory 10% annual increases in Social Security benefits. I mean, the program was vastly expanded, and the 82 the solution, the Greenspan Commission, was a temporary fix. Nobody thought that this was going to alter the imbalance of the program, the very large implicit long-term debts that were being compiled. There's a lot of monkey business in Medicare budgeting. The budgets project draconian restrictions on doctors' salaries far into the future that are always relieved when the time comes. So I think that the essential dynamic that I've described is true. I think that it is bipartisan in its origins, and one can't look one way or the other. Keynes had this great idea that in hard times, economic hard times, not just wars and natural disasters, that was a good reason to borrow against the future. But in practical politics, it turned out different, because it meant that political officials, when they were setting this year's budget, they were comparing today's needs, the needs of a real problem-strewn today that we all live in, with an imagined future. And they were Americans, so the future was always going to be bright and lovely and wonderful. It became very, very easy to say, we will just spend more today because tomorrow's going to be fine, especially if we can get past all these terrible problems that we've got this year. So I think that Keynesianism in practical politics encouraged some very, very bad habits, which were to relieve constraints today by leaving problems to people tomorrow. Similarly, on the right, the idea of supply-side economics was originally to produce growth by lowering marginal tax rates. But in the hands of practical politicians, it acquired a secondary purpose, that conservatives, instead of coming in and mopping up after the disasters left by big spending Democrats, would not be fiscal prudes, but instead would promise, instead of more spending, lower taxes. And that developed a dynamic of its own, which became doctrinaire within the Republican Party. So there's a partisan aspect to it, but all of this could not have happened, but in a very, very rich society. I see this as a problem of how to govern ourselves when we become very autonomous and very, very wealthy. We can in America borrow huge amounts of money in ways that previous societies never did, and we have adopted this. We've gotten into some very bad habits by taking advantage of this new power we have and just spending it on ourselves and relieving pressures on current day politics by borrowing, not to invest in the future, but to borrow from the future.
I'll get to the questions from the floor in just a second. I will ask Professor Super, since you haven't said anything, if anything you'd like to add about anything any of the other panelists have said or the discussion just now?
I think that the other panelists have captured it well.
Okay, thank you. Over here, and if you could state your name and your school, please.
Okay.
And let me make just a general. Sorry, just the general point that please make it a question.
Definitely make it a question.
Good.
My name is Catherine Trent. I am from Oklahoma City University School of Law. Can you hear me okay? Okay. My question is for Professor David Super. You painted a pretty rosy picture of the SNAP program, and I have some questions about the criticisms of the SNAP program. Basically, there's a documentary called Stuffed But Starving. I don't know if you're familiar with that documentary. Basically, they go through the problems with nutritional value of the food that's being purchased through the SNAP program. And so my question is about the WIC program. There have been proposals for structuring the SNAP program like the WIC program in requiring people to buy low-cost, whole, healthy foods, which is what the WIC program does at a fraction of the cost. And I just wonder why, my question is, why hasn't that taken root? And what would it take for it to take root? Because I think it would save us a significant amount of money and also contribute to a more healthy society.
Fair question. The answer, a lot of the answer to that I think is operational. Food stamps is made to serve a wider range of people. WIC serves as a limited supplement to a few very specific demographic groups whose nutritional needs we can we understand somewhat better. And secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, it's administered at the checkout line. And WIC is a little bit cumbersome. There are little stickers about WIC eligible that are on the shelves, but have to be handled with some energy by checkers. If the food stamp participants, a vastly larger group, had to be sorting their goods at the checkout stand, this is acceptable, this is not, the administrative burden, I think, would be quite staggering. And in some ways, WIC can do it because food stamps doesn't. WIC is only a supplemental program. It doesn't attempt to cover the full range of people's nutritional needs. For about a quarter of food stamp recipients, their incomes are so low that they're not assumed to have any cash available for it.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, yes. My name is Tucker Pryor. I'm from Florida International University. This question touches on something that Dr. Galston had said, but welcome response from anybody. It interests me. I was a teacher at high school and community college level for many years. I'm just curious as to, with the whole push for free community college, that this kind of growing trend, barring an overhaul of the educational system, how do we get towards a more vocational educational system when there seems to be such an emphasis or a desire for this free community college?
Well, I think part of the pressure on community colleges reflects the fact that young people who would like to get career-associated technical training, by and large, can't get it in high schools. And I think one of the many advantages, there are many advantages to starting it in the 9th or 10th grade and taking it seriously. One of them, not the only one, is that it would make much more efficient use of existing resources as opposed to placing yet another financial burden on the exchequers of federal, state, and local governments. Number two, I would hypothesize, and I'd love to be able to check this, that it would be significantly reduce high school dropout rates by giving young people who are not very academically or college-oriented a real incentive to stay and study and acquire an economically useful skill. So I think the right time to talk about adjusting the finances of community colleges is after we've maximized the utility of the resources that we're currently devoting to high schools and take seriously technical and vocational training in that context.
Anyone else have any observations on that question? Okay, over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Kelly from the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Galston, a few months ago in one of your Wall Street Journal columns, you addressed the barriers to opportunity faced by minority Americans, and especially those barriers' impact on their social mobility. In your opinion, is social safety net spending an efficient means to removing those barriers, or is there some better, more efficient alternative that we could have?
Well, unlike perhaps some other people on the panel, I regard a long list of barriers to opportunity as being more significant than social safety net programs. And for example, I named a few in my opening remarks. And I saw some heads nodding. If a young person makes a mistake, commits a felony, goes to prison for 2 or 3 years, that should not represent permanent exile from the paid labor force. So talk about removing barriers. Let's start by removing the legal barriers that prevent a number of ex-offenders from participating in a number of categories of employment where, with suitable vetting and training and oversight, they could probably do very well. And so removing barriers to the employment of ex-felons is it would be a big step forward. I would also say, and this will get to the topic of the next panel, which they've doubled my fee to serve on as well, as Chris DeMuth pointed out, that very low quality K-12 education is one of the most significant barriers to mobility and opportunity in today's society. So, the argument that if we only cut the food stamp program, that young people would be surging ahead and they'd be much more mobile, I think doesn't pass the laugh test. The barriers to opportunity are just that, barriers that need to be torn down. And I've had a long debate with a fellow at Chris DeMuth's former institution, Nicholas Eberstadt, the author of the famous 47% figure that Mitt Romney picked up to his sorrow. And I do not believe that people are settling down into this comfortable hammock. The evidence for that, it seems to me, that is an ideological trope with not a lot of evidence in support of it. That is not the principal problem we face in this country, if you're interested in social mobility.
Anyone else want to pick up on that?
I think we're all talking about getting rid of barriers to opportunity, but I see you, I think as I made clear in my remarks, I wouldn't make a lot of people felons in the first place.
Yeah. Who on the panel do you think disagrees
exactly,
with the felons
I mentioned
and
decriminalization.
K-12?
Too many people are.
Do you disagree with it?
No, of course not. I mean, so I guess that what I would argue is instead of try to even be more ambitious. I mean, this report is all very well, the opportunity, responsibility, and security, but frankly, there's not much to object to in it, but it seems to me a combination of fairly thin gruel and things that are unlikely to be easy to to put into operation, such as the encouragement of marriage and so forth. It's not there isn't some good stuff, but I think bigger. So in addition to thinking let's try to facilitate the reintegration of non-dangerous felons into the workforce, think about reducing the number of people who are felons in the first place. That's all I'm urging.
Well, as the author of a soon-to-be-released report on incarceration and incarceration reform, we're agreeing vehemently on that point. And I was not suggesting that we didn't. But I do think there may be a disagreement about the incentive effects of current safety net programs, and to the extent that there is, I've staked out my position quite clearly on the relative impact of that vis-a-vis affirmative obstacles, which I think it should be the principal function of liberals and conservatives alike to reduce or eliminate to the greatest extent possible. So, and with regard to this report, I'm glad we're generating a little disagreement here. Otherwise, what's a panel for? With regard to this report, the effort of the report, let me remind the assembled company, was to locate areas of agreement across a wide ideological spectrum in a context in which the Congress of the United States cannot agree on where to have lunch together. And as a result, they never have lunch together. Believe me, I could think up all sorts of ambitious new ideas. I could think bigger. The question is, in a polarized political context, if you think bigger, can you create a political consensus around those large thoughts?
Yes, there is a lot more consensus to be had than is in this report. I like a lot of this report, but there's a lot more out there, a lot more possible than is in this report. Absolutely.
Good. Then then I think you should write another report.
Very good. Next question.
My name is Kevin Diaz from Florida National University College of Law. My question was just going off of Mr. DeMuth's point regarding transitioning from the debt financing into the tax-based financing now. How do you believe we're going to transition into that? Like, how is that going to take place? And if it does, like, is it going to be an attainable goal within our future or within our lifetime specifically?
We're thinkers, and to ask us to predict the future of the practical world is very, very difficult. But let me say, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but when I started talking at the end about crisis response, it is because this project, this very admirable project, it had this particular thing of the intersection of the two partisan sets. But think tankers at AEI and Brookings and Cato and the Urban Institute have been working on very, very smart plans for feathering in reforms over a couple of decades that actually would produce sustainable safety net and poverty programs for a long time. And I've been part of them. When I was running a think tank, AEI, I thought it was an important part of what I should do because Congress wasn't making much progress. I'm impressed at how little has actually been done. There is an earnest reform wing of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but if I look at national politics, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination is not going to touch Social Security no matter what ever. Okay? The leading candidate for the Democratic nomination wants to expand it somewhat in a way that would make it less sustainable. And the runner-up for the Democratic nomination wants a fantastic expansion based on utterly false ideas of being able to finance it by raising taxes on the rich. So in kind of active frontline politics, I don't see much that's happening. I think if we had people like Bill Galston, Paul Ryan, the authors of this report actually sitting on the relevant committees in Congress and in the White House, I think we could do that. But if we look at the actual operation of our politics, that's what tells me that our getting to a currently financed largely currently financed welfare state is going to be very, very contentious, and we're probably going to wait until there is a crisis, a huge run-up in interest rates, something like what at a national level what Detroit and Puerto Rico have been facing. I'm not certain of that, but the numbers are so large, and the time is now drawing pretty close. You know, I can remember 30 years ago saying, you know, this is a problem, but we can do it. We've got the time, and we're running out of time. And when I look at these presidential debates, I don't see anybody really kind of seizing the moment.
Let me just offer a slightly more optimistic gloss. There's a famous quotation from Winston Churchill, which I'm sure you've all heard, to the effect that America will always do the right thing after it's exhausted all of the available alternatives. And and I will confess that my optimism is conditioned by my own service as a senior official of the Clinton administration. As you may recall, during that period, discretionary spending as a share of gross domestic product declined by more than it had since the Eisenhower administration. And there was a steady movement towards fiscal balance that culminated in 4 consecutive years of budget surpluses. And I will refrain from any more partisan comments as to why those surpluses disappeared when they did, but you know what I'm thinking. And
9/11.
Yeah, yeah, which explains Part D of Medicare, no doubt. So in fact, in fact, I suspect. Let's just take one example again: Social Security. There are all sorts of plans on the shelf for a balanced approach to Social Security financial stabilization that will not be obsolete. They'll be much more urgent, but they won't be obsolete. The parameters of those solutions will be steeper the longer we wait. There's no question about that. But there is a reason why neither political party is talking about reforming or cutting Social Security at this point, and that is when recently re-elected President George W. Bush tried to do it in 2005, he got his head handed to him by his own party.
Over here.
I'm Jason Halligan from Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School. There's a growing movement now to have investments in social impact bonds, public-private partnerships, and a focus on social investments. And I'm wondering if there's any potential for these programs to replace part of the safety net through either services or through direct payments themselves through private charities.
It's always possible, I think, to have civic society expand and offer things that, as I mentioned, are similar to government services more efficiently and in ways that have that harness knowledge of time and place. The difficulty with some of the programs that you've just mentioned is, I think, frankly, transparency and accountability. They can be very opaque. And so they have to be designed very carefully, and they have to be monitored, and even the successful ones can be very hard to scale. Others?
Anyone else? Here.
Hi, I'm John, and I'm at Yale. I just wanted to see if we could contextualize or perhaps operationalize some of the criticisms that you've levied at the current state of the safety net and poverty. And I'm originally from Kentucky, and so one area of poverty that is especially important to me is Appalachia. And I think that for each of the things that you've described, that matters. Each of the things described matters for that region of the country and the poverty that is endemic to that area. And so specifically with regards to what you talked about in your remarks, so for example, the deficit spending that has funded the welfare state, how do you see the policies and the ideologies that you've articulated affecting on the ground people today in Eastern Kentucky?
Would like to.
I've been talking too much, so would someone else start? I will pitch in.
Professor Super? Sorry for calling on someone. I know this is like a cold call, but
You are a law professor. The food stamp program, SNAP, I think has done what, to some extent, what it can in Appalachia. The participation rates there in Kentucky, as well as other states in the region, are relatively high. It is substantially different there than in, say, Louisville or Lexington or what have you. Having the money coming in for food is keeping some number of stores open, which makes it possible to buy food without driving great distances.
If I may, you mind if
yeah,
I push back
please.
a little bit? So one of the other issues that is endemic in Eastern Kentucky is the issue of drug use, whether it's prescription drug use or illegal drug use. And part of that is financed by using food stamps as a currency to turn into things that are traded then for drugs. And so I wonder how that affects your analysis of the high usage of SNAP in Eastern Kentucky.
There is some of that. The research, I mean, the program is serving tens of millions of people. It's no surprise, any group of tens of millions of people, that there will be even a tiny fraction of those recipients are misusing the program. That's in absolute numbers a lot of people. All the research has shown that the number of people that are trafficking food stamps has been steadily declining, in part because of the shift away from paper coupons that really could be another currency into an electronic system where you can't really trade it without the cooperation of a retailer. And USDA has been, for the last number of years, engaged in a major purge of retailers to get the ones that are likely to be or at least are at risk of engaging in that off the program. So we've reduced that some. There certainly is some of that going on out there, and my sense is that efforts are being made to shrink it, but you're certainly right that that is a problem, and abuses of programs, SNAP, Social Security, SSI, and others can be part of that.
The importance of access to health care. And as I mentioned in my remarks, I think it was unfortunate that the Affordable Care Act focused on coverage, getting people enrolled in insurance programs or getting people signed up for Medicaid, instead of focusing on what I see as very severe and very important gaps in our safety net, which is timely access to appropriate health care. And so in order to meet some of those demands, we need more than to simply say that we've signed people up for, say, Medicaid, which is, as you know, in some states Medicaid hasn't been expanded. But even where Medicaid has been expanded, the research coming out about Medicaid is quite disappointing in terms of how much it helps people. We clearly need better programs, and we have to. I believe we need to hold ourselves to a very high standard here, in terms of improving access to health care and designing programs that will actually deliver benefits to people.
Do you have any ideas on what you might do?
I think more use of clinics, low cost or even free, things that will get people in to be seen by healthcare practitioners, much better use of triage, better use of information technologies, in particular for things like mental health experts and so forth. Being able to get evaluations by Skype has been, I think, a huge benefit in a huge advance in many rural counties. And we can build on that. And so in my opening remarks, and then in some of the things that I've been saying on the panel, I've been trying to spur us to think about what we have that we could build on without that much additional money spent, because as we have been detailing, we're under a lot of pressure, and also very importantly, how we could do things quickly. I mean, it's been 6 years almost since the Affordable Care Act has passed, and we do have fewer people, quote, uninsured, but a lot of those people who are now insured are in insurance programs with huge deductibles, and realistically, the people don't have, a lot of the insured don't have the cash, and that's absolutely true in the area that you're describing. So, with those as preliminary ideas, I'd go from there.
Thank you. Over here. I'm sorry, Dr. Golston, please.
Let me, I mean, your question is so poignant. That I'll think out loud about it. Let me make 3 points. Number one, in the right here and right now, we have an opioid addiction and abuse crisis. And unlike previous drug crises, it is most pervasive not in the big cities, but in rural and small town America, throughout Appalachia and in upper New England. And as you may have noticed, the only issue that was seriously discussed in New Hampshire was this epidemic. So on an emergency basis, there are 2 things that we need to do. First of all, the FDA, which usually slows drug approval down, for some reason has been really enthusiastic about approving new opioids. And there was just a big ruckus in the Senate, as you may have noticed, about the confirmation of the new FDA director, because the opposing senators were trying to pressure the FDA into slowing down that process. That was the issue that held up his confirmation. The second thing that's going on there is that physicians are being irresponsible in their prescription practices. And if I had a lot more time, I could detail just how irresponsible they've been. And so state medical associations and state medical licensures bodies really should crack down on physicians whose statistics reveal, an almost pell-mell resort to opioids, and not only prescribing them, but prescribing them in quantities far in excess of the reasonable usage for the diagnosed problem, which means that which means you get 48, you use 6, you have 42 left, and in low-income communities, the incentive to do something wrong with those 42 remaining pills must be overwhelming. But now let me go bigger. Let's look at Appalachia for a minute. This is beyond a discussion of the social safety net. I don't need to tell you that the twin bases of the Appalachian economy, namely low-wage manufacturing and high-wage coal mining, have collapsed more or less simultaneously. The economic base of an entire region of the country has been destroyed. And that raises a very interesting question, or two very interesting questions. Number one, why hasn't new investment come in to create new employment and production activities in the area proportionate to the void that's been created? And how can we think more creatively about establishing the conditions where that new investment would come in? And secondly, why haven't more people from the region drawn the consequences from their surrounding circumstances and moved to areas of greater opportunity? Why isn't half of the young Appalachian population in Texas right now? Maybe it is. But at some point, if you're 20 and you look around and you see there's nothing for you, you should get the heck out. And I don't understand why even more of that isn't happening.
It is happening, and that's part of the issue, that you have a big brain drain that is sucking the intellectual resources out of the region.
Well, that may be, but until this investment and job creation conundrum is solved, not by creating new jobs programs in Appalachia the way the late Senator Byrd did, but by paving over this whole state, in effect. Is a very nice parking lot, the non-hilly portion thereof. But in fact, thinking hard about creating the conditions for serious economic development in Appalachia. And that doesn't mean just reading the latest nostrums from the Appalachian Regional Commission, which has done very little good in its decades of existence, as far as I can tell, at least good for the people. It means taking economic development seriously. It means, among other things, creating an educational system that creates a workforce that people from the outside would be willing to invest in, just for starts.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Please.
Hi, I'm Tex Pasley, and I go to school here. I guess my question was going to be about how no one had really spoken much in the discussion, except for Professor Mahoney, about healthcare, and then you kind of did. But I guess I'll just make the question more pointed then and ask if you could comment on what, especially with like Social Security, for instance, one threat to its long-term solvency is the increase in healthcare spending as a function of inflation just nationwide. It's much more expensive and getting much more expensive. So I guess I just wanted to hear your comments, maybe particularly on how rising healthcare costs are going to cut into the social safety net in the future, and what we can do under the Affordable Care Act as it exists now to improve that.
Was that for me?
I think so.
Well, this is a little, I don't know that my policy ideas are all that important here. I would, let me go back to Dr. Galston. I'm going to answer your question, I promise. He quoted Hayek. You'd be surprised to hear that Hayek was in favor of the welfare state. That was in the Road to Serfdom. But in Hayek's later book, and his greatest one, The Constitution of Liberty, which is addressed, he came out emphatically for a welfare state, including mandatory health insurance. He had all sorts of big ideas. What he was opposed to was government provision, government monopolization of the supply of these services. And I think that the problem, the essential problem with our health care programs, Obamacare, Medicare, Medicaid, is that they are, if I may say, Stalin-esque programs. They're very much top-down. We've got lots and lots of rules, and you're going to obey them. We're going to regulate everybody's prices. We're going to have a lot of detailed things that react to momentary political issues at the national level, so that we now have an exception for birth control. Not only does every university and every employer have to provide it, but it's got to be free. No deductibles, no nothing. Well, where quite did that come from? So I think we've got a really terrible health care system. And what I would do for the vast majority of Americans, I would voucherize the whole thing. I would convert it for middle-class Americans. I would have it a voucherized program that essentially guaranteed everybody a certain amount to buy health insurance, and have the contours of that health insurance very, very lightly regulated. I think that that's actually, conceptually, it's pretty easy. And when we got some competition in the system, which we lack right now, and we got rid of a lot of state regulation of whether you can invest in a new CAT machine, so that people that are in the market can keep people out of the market, which is what we used to do with railroads and airlines. I think that if we de-Stalinized the system, marketized the system, we would solve most of the serious problems we have today. For the very poor, however, I'm very much with Professor Mahoney. I think that we have, I think the idea of having health insurance program, medical insurance programs for very, very poor people, including a lot of people such as undocumented immigrants who are kind of in the shadows of life, is difficult, and that the secret is special clinics that serve the needs of the poor, especially poor families, and I think that that has to be government organized and provided. I'd like it at the local level. I'd like a lot of private sector involvement in it, of course. But for everybody else, I'd voucherize the system. And that essentially is what Hayek proposed in 1960, before any of these debates began.
I'd add just a couple of things. I agree with everything just said. One is that it's very hard to define health care. For example, is healthy food going to be defined as a kind of health care, or your exercise classes, your running shoes, and so on? Right now, no. But those might be, but maybe we should. So we have so we start with the difficulty of defining what we mean by health care. So when you talk about health care spending, it's already quite arbitrary. Second thing is that however you define health care spending, I don't know if we spend too much on it. I think health is priceless, and I think everyone else does too. Maybe we spend too little. Whether we spend too much, too little, it's just so difficult to say, because we want to know what can we get for our money. And so so I think a lot of this debate ends up getting shaped by an assumption that we, quote, spend too much on health care, linked to a fairly random definition of health care.
I guess within the context of the social safety net, that the percentage of just a standard American wage, a lot of it that goes to healthcare costs.
Exactly, and then you have to decide what else you're going to spend money on. I mean, so for example, if we could cure more things, or treat more things, or treat pain without causing these addiction problems, then you might think that it's a good thing to spend more of your dollar on health care. I think but having said all that, I think there is some low-hanging fruit in addition to what we've already mentioned on this panel. In areas where there is competition, such as cosmetic surgery, LASIK, fertility treatment, and so on, we do see prices come down. We do see technological innovations bending down that cost curve. And that we might not be able to harness that in every area of healthcare, but I bet we could do a lot more. So that's one possibility. Second is to figure out how to harness more of the power of generosity. both in terms of the monetary contributions, as I think has already been discussed, but also we now have a system where it is harder for health practitioners to be generous because of the sclerotic regulations that they are subjected to. It's tougher for them to just use that extra hour to see someone who is, say, living in the shadows or something. So we ought to think about how to free that up. And we can go on from there. There's a lot more. It's a great question. It would just, we could have a whole other panel on it, but thank you.
Veterinary medicine also. Yes. Of you first. Veterinary medicine.
One last question. So.
Gene Meyer, Federalist Society. I wonder what we are getting. One factor in healthcare costs is that technology has improved enormously, which means there are many people who 40 years ago would have had a fatal disease that now we can, at a major cost, do something about. That trend is likely to continue.
And I think that's a great trend. We've turned.
I'm not complaining about the trend, but I am asking, how does that trend conceptually fit in with the concept of safety net? As it becomes possible to, in theory, cure almost any disease, if hypothetically it becomes that way, but the cost is very significant. How should we go about thinking about that, particularly? I mean, for a pure libertarian point of view, it becomes, I suppose, fairly easy. But for everybody else, how do we go about thinking about that? Most people say, well, at some level, we should have a safety net. At what level? How do we logically think about what level that should be?
I think it's fairly easy conceptually, and the challenge is practical and political. And it's very much like the question of having more things such as Social Security means tested, so that people who've turned out okay in life are not getting these same subsidies as the poor. And we can say that, and Bill can do his research and show that you could decouple the thing and have political support, but it doesn't happen. It's hard to get it done. I use the example of birth control. The democratic dynamics are to offer insurance for routine day-to-day things, okay? Medicare is not a catastrophic insurance program. Well, we ought to orient public participation towards having everybody have catastrophic insurance, because now there are going to be substantial numbers of people who are going to be facing diseases at some point, which we can actually do something about at fabulous cost. It's something that we as a society can take care of, but when it hits one person, it's a huge lump sum. That's what insurance is for. And catastrophic health insurance is undersupplied in the United States because of this strong political dynamic in having, insurance that covers getting your teeth cleaned. That seems to have real political resonance, and we need to shift it in the opposite direction. So I think conceptually I can describe it, and getting the political process to move in that direction is the challenge. Does that make sense to some people?
Let me agree.
That actually know about these?
Let me agree with Chris emphatically on this point. An analogy that I sometimes use is home insurance. Who buys home insurance to defray the cost of every 5-year paint job, right? I mean, you buy home insurance to protect against catastrophic loss. And that's what insurance is. First dollar coverage is not insurance. It's something else, and something much more expensive and something much less justifiable. And I would say that what's true for private insurance, mutatis mutandis, should be true for public insurance as well. So I think that is absolutely the beginning of wisdom. Let me just offer one other sort of ameliorating response, which should find some favor in this room. Whatever kinds of services you're talking about, I think we can agree that delivering them with as much efficiency, competition, and price competitiveness as the system will allow full transparency is really important. I'll pick just one example. MRIs in Washington, D.C. Do you know that there's almost a 5-fold gap between the most and least expensive MRI visit? You can get it for as low as $2,500, but if you'd really like to spend $2,500, you know, I know some places where you can do that too. This is nuts, right? And, you know, and so to the extent that price transparency within particular geographical catchment areas can become the rule rather than the exception, I think we would begin to squeeze a lot of the excess out of the system. I mean, it is just stunning to the extent to which the the portions of the healthcare system that could be run on sensible market principles aren't, and we're paying a huge price for it as a society.
Well, thank you. With that tribute to the power of competitive markets, we're concluded. Let's thank the panel.